Hello and welcome back to a new series of the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Whitaker and I hope to provide you with as many conversations with documentary filmmakers as I can over the next few months. There should be one at least every fortnight. We have some great interviews lined up in which I'll talk to producers and directors about their films, both in terms of the subjects they choose and the way in which they fund, craft and distribute their work. In this episode, I discuss Sugarcane with directors Kassie and Julian of NoiseCat. It's an epic, nuanced and personal cinematic portrait of a community during a moment of international reckoning. The film follows a groundbreaking investigation into abuse and unexplained deaths at an Indian residential school in Canada, revealing heartbreaking intergenerational traumas and attempts to understand and rebuild family bonds. The filmmaking team sensitively captured the unfolding story over a 2-year period, and co-director Julian simultaneously explores the impact of the abuse on his own family. It's a phenomenal film, and it's no surprise that it won a Best Director award at Sundance, as well as many other awards. I'll play the trailer here first, and that will be shortly followed by my conversation with Kassie and Julian.
I felt dirty as Indian all my life in residential school.
Look at that. It's all names.
When you're brought up in an institution like the Catholic Church, you have strict rules and you went with their ethics.
I've been trying to find out what happened at St. Joseph's Mission.
Everything was so secretive.
My dad was born there. How did it happen?
It's not something that you want to open up, it just keeps on damaging.
For decades, there were reports of neglect and children dying or disappearing from this facility.
2 girls drowned. Priests were moved around.
Why are they dying? Did they think we'd be stupid all of our lives, the rest of our lives, and nobody would ever find out these things?
Just to give people a bit of background, can you explain what the film is about for people who haven't heard about it yet?
Sure. So Sugarcane follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian residential school, St. Joseph's Mission, near Williams Lake, British Columbia, which is the school that my family was sent away to.
It's a very personal film for you, Julian, and as I understand it, you two worked together previous to this. You were looking for a project to do together. Can you tell me a little bit about the background that led to this film being made?
So my background is as a filmmaker and investigative journalist. I've focused on telling stories around the world on human rights abuses and conflict and people caught in the crossfires from Afghanistan to the Saharan Desert. And yet I had never turned my lens on my own country. I'm Canadian, and the horrors that it perpetrated against its First Peoples. And so when the news of potential unmarked graves at a former Indian residential school in Kamloops broke, I felt immediately pulled and moved profoundly by the story, and felt that that this was where I needed to be in the world. And the first thing that I did was text Julian because Jules and I worked our first reporting jobs together. As you know, we were randomly sat at the desks next to each other, became fast friends. And in the years since, Julian went on to become an incredible writer and journalist and historian of Indigenous life in North America, and just had such a clear voice and perspective and deep knowledge of these communities. And so it felt like a really natural fit for us to work on something together with my kind of documentary and visual skill set and focus on these types of difficult stories. And so Jules told me he'd get back to me, he'd do some thinking about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search, because it seemed natural to tell the story of a search. And I found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers and the Williams Lake First Nation. And I sent Chief Willie a cold email, and he called me back that same afternoon, and he said, the creator has always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search. So I spoke to council on Zoom and booked flights and got my gear together, and I was getting ready to go 2 weeks later, and that's when I heard back from Jules.
And when I called Em back, that's when I told her, hey, I'd be open to collaborating with you on this documentary. And she said, great, I've identified a First Nation that's leading a search. And that search is happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. And as you might imagine, I couldn't believe what I just heard. And then I said, wow, that's really crazy. Did you know that that's the school that my family was sent to and where my father was born? So out of 139 Indian residential schools in Canada, Em happened to choose the one school that my family was taken away to and where my father's life began. So, what are the odds?
And how did you feel about that, Julian? Did that make it easier to say yes or to continue or harder?
It's impossible to say no. So, the reason why I was so hesitant to work on a story about Indian residential schools is that I didn't know what my family's specific story was. I had spent time on the res. I'd spent time learning language with my cat. And if you learn language from, somebody who was not allowed to speak that language at the school, and the reason why the language is dying is because of that history of intense cultural assimilation led by the residential schools, you inevitably are going to ask questions, right, about it. And I had gleaned from the very few things that she had been willing to tell me that it had been a very, very intense, very horrific kind of experience. But I didn't really know anything more than that. And I'd heard that my dad had been born in Williams Lake and found in a trash can. But that's all I knew. I didn't know that it had anything to do with the schools. And so I was, hesitant to take that story on in any medium, especially in, a new medium. The other thing that was going on is that I had just signed a book contract, and I'd never written a book, and I've never made a film. And to do both at the same time seemed kind of crazy, obviously. And so I needed to really think hard about whether I was going to be able to take this on just from like a, work time standpoint. And, after committing to it, I would say that there were many junctures where I felt like it was too hard, where it felt like it was too heavy, it was too personal. Even in the early going when I was not going to be a participant in the documentary, it was very, very, very challenging subject to work on for me. And ultimately, I think that the fact that it was the school that my family was sent to, that my dad's story and his birth at the mission was at the center of an unreported story about what happened to the babies born at this particular school, made it something that I could not step away from, and also something that I could not avoid telling in a personal way, because ultimately, if your friend who's a filmmaker reaches out and happens to choose to focus a documentary on the school where your father was born in secret and discarded and found, and that's the reason why you exist, you kind of have to tell that story, especially when, the survivors and leaders from the community are, giving us so much. When Rick, for example, is giving us so much in the film. And so ultimately, I'm really grateful that I did, do it and didn't run away from it and told it in the way that we chose to tell it. But it was incredibly challenging. And I knew that from the moment that Em reached out, that it was going to be one of the hardest things I'd ever do.
Emily, you mentioned the search, and it feels like for a filmmaker, a really natural thing to cling on to is it's that's going to give you some narrative engine and arc and so on. But like any great film, there's so many more layers to it, and so much of that comes from Julian too. What were your early conversations like in terms of trying to figure out the emphasis of your work as a duo, your interests and so on? Because, being open, I suppose, to what you're going to find and so on feels like such an important part of taking on a project like this, which ultimately I think went on for quite a long time.
Well, because we chose to make this as a verite film, we were committing to living the story. So we knew that there was a reckoning happening in this moment as the search was unfolding. And it was really the first day I got there, and Jules met me there a few days later. But the first day I was put in a room with Chief Willie and Charlene and Rick and other members of council. But as soon as I met the three of them, it was just so clear that they had such a strong role to play in the telling of the story. Rick told me stories that night, about his Catholic faith and the conflict he had with that. It was very clear that he was partly white. I didn't know what the story was there, but there was something there, and that he was reckoning with his identity in some way, and was a survivor of the school. Charlene is this, intrepid investigator and has been leading these inquiries into what happened in the school for 30 years. This is her life's work. And Chief Willie was trying to keep his community alive in the midst of all of this. The part I didn't factor in was that Julian was going to become a part of the story and his family was going to be part of the story. So, Jules got there and he can speak to this, but very much felt the same way about those three characters, about Willie, about Charlene, and about Rick. And so we kind of dedicated ourselves to following them and their lives in this moment and see what came of that. And, I think that the investigation itself gave us this kind of central thrust. But was really special about the collaboration was that we would film, 16 hours a day. We'd be filming through the night along the riverbed till 4 a.m. And then we'd come back to our little, either the res and that little house we were living in, or eventually we were in an Airbnb, me, Julian, and Chris, our DP who I shot with. And Jules and I would just like stay up and talk about what we had seen and the themes and what we were moved by and where the story might go and the things we were wrestling with. And Julian would say things that were so key to the perspective and understanding of the world we were moving through. And so he would say something like, this is a post-apocalyptic world for Indigenous peoples. Okay, well, what does that look like? And the apocalypse, of course, being colonization. And so capturing the kind of, the burn of the forest fires that ravaged, the surrounding areas. Like we have that shot of the burnt trees in a particular moment. It's a 2-mill town. So capturing extractive industry, having a conversation between kind of the epic landscape and these, the river that provided life to his peoples for since time immemorial, in contrast with what had been overtaken. He would say something like, this is a community living on the edge of death. Well, that looked like Julian attending 10 funerals during the making of this film, and I attended several myself. Because these are communities that have been, ravaged by the highest rates of suicide and overdose and addiction because of what these schools did to 4+ generations of their families. And so, how do we implement that in the visual language of the film? It looked like me getting 6 feet down in the grave with Willie as he was digging the grave of his friend and community member, and filming the sound of the shovel going against the dirt. And so these were some of the conversations we would have, one more being, this is a Western town, and what would it mean to tell a story about a reverse Western, where there are cowboys and Indians and Indian cowboys, and where the kind of contrasts between the iconographies of the church come up against, the presence of the spirit world. These are all conversations that Jules and I would have, and then we would incorporate into the way we were making the film.
And then I would just add to that M has a really significant background as an investigative journalist. So, I think that obviously we couldn't have made the film that we made without, my perspectives as someone who lives this and has been thinking about it and writing about it for my whole life. But at the same time, like the robustness of the investigation of the film, and not just the investigation that we follow in the film, but also of the investigative work of the film itself, is definitely a part of M's like legacy, not just as a visual journalist, but also as like someone who's done some serious investigative journalism, and thought about how this film would also have journalistic and investigative merit, and then also in certain moments how we would do that visually too. The ways that we portray like some of the stuff on the walls and all that sort of stuff. M was very, very intentional about that piece as well. And I just want to in case you didn't know, like this film like does break investigative ground. Like this is the story of what happened to the babies at St. Joseph's Mission was an unreported story, and there are no similar stories yet reported at schools across North America. So we really are trying to push this conversation in new directions, not just emotionally and intellectually, but also investigatively, if that's grammatically correct phrase.
I was wondering just there when you were talking about kind of those conversational sessions you would have at the end of filming days, and the amount of hours that you clearly filmed, did you come up with a kind of filmmaking system to allow you to be able to know what of those 10 hours a day or whatever it might have been at different times you would use or you would be able to come back to? Because obviously, to make the kind of film that you made, you have to spend a lot of time in there. You do have to film a lot, but ultimately there is a reckoning with the footage as well. So did you have any way of kind of dealing with that as you went along?
Conversation.
Yeah. We shot 160 days for this film. Obviously, that's not all in there.
We took a very maximalist approach to that.
Yeah, we followed every thread. Like we really, really did. But we just knew. I mean, it was very organic. It wasn't very systematic. It was just like we could feel it when there was
we talked about it.
Yeah.
Of course, like we talked about it the day before we went to the shoot. What our priorities would be. We'd be talking about it while we were there. Things would arise. Things would fall by the wayside. It was. Yeah.
But then
I think the real thing was just what was really smart about M's initial instincts was to follow an investigation. I think that always gave us something to come back to. It gave us a core narrative thread. It didn't follow we initially thought that the unmarked graves were going to be where that ended. And obviously, of course, that's not where that narrative thread ended. And that was the twist and turn that we followed. But I think having that through line, was really essential to allowing us to, have something that we would come back to. And then also knowing that these adventures that we'd go off on in the lives of our characters and the life of the community, ultimately would wend their way back to something that had a clear beginning and ending in some way, shape, or form.
And, Jules and I created this really shared vision by the time we got to the edit. However, the editors, did a tremendous job. We brought them, a 5.5 hour cut. We're like, we love this. And they're like, you want to make a series or you want to make a feature? We're like, a feature. So it had to be cut down. And then the question was, how do you weave together 4 different storylines? And we actually had more than that when we started. We had about 6 or 7 storylines with the investigation. How do you drip information? What parts fall away? What do we let go of? And so much of that was in the edit. And a huge credit to Maya Daisy Hawk and Nathan Punwar, who expertly helped us figure out how to weave this together and pace it in a way that people could both immerse themselves in the world of this community and also, be brought in by these kind of nuggets of reveals and intrigue and mystery and revelation, and then figuring out when to have an emotional climax and when to give people space to process it. That was such a kind of endless process of trial and error and iteration. And, there are storylines we lost in the last week, mostly because, some of us weren't ready to let them go until the last week.
I think that it was also one of the big, I mean, the biggest picture. I think that it was about letting go, but it was also about figuring out how to see things, with new eyes constantly, how to see things fresh, both literally scenes that we knew had to be in the film. And then also sometimes, looking back at the material that we had and had looked over and had, maybe passed on, to find at the end in particular, this was really important to find, little bits of things and other stuff that helped us, make it into like a film.
Yeah, there are two examples of that come to mind. We watched back all the footage again towards the end of shooting, of the edit, and there was like we couldn't crack that introduction of Rick, because we were like, okay, we need you to know that he's both Indigenous and Catholic. We need you to know that he's a survivor of the school, that he went to the school. We need you to know that he's a former chief. We need you to know that he is bringing back artifacts from the church that he and his wife were scared was going to be burned down because of the revelations, and that he is struggling with all of these things and his identity without saying it. And it took many iterations, and then we came across that little piece where it's the only time we have someone speaking to camera on the entire film. And it breaks the fourth wall, where he tells the story of holding the book over his head at the school. And that cracked that scene. And that came in the last couple weeks, that we found that little moment, and we're like, this is what brings that together. Another is like figuring out, what do we want to say about Trudeau? So I sent Julian Trudeau's bit, and I was like, which is the part of this that says the most about what that was and who he is in this moment? And Julian was like, well, it's got to be the French part, where he does his little speech and then this very Canadian thing of like automatically switching to French and performing it all over again. And then, of course, the question that the reporter asks of like, why are you doing this in the exact moment that the Pope is doing this? And, the needing of Justin Trudeau to like apologize before the Pope does. And so it was like little moments that really cracked final constructions of the scenes and brought the film together that really happened in the last few weeks.
And also elevated the cinematography of particular moments. Like one thing that we really wanted to do well was there's that moment that we go to the sweat, the ceremony, right before the results of the ground penetrating radar study are revealed to the community. And, you could probably count on one hand the number of times that a sweat has been represented in the entire history of film. And hopefully that changes in the future. There are countless representations of baptisms, for example, some very famous ones like The Godfather. And, I think that we tried to be conscious of the fact that if we did our jobs well, this would be a representation of a significant thing in Native spiritual and cultural life that other filmmakers in the future would look back at and think through, how am I going to be in conversation in someday with Sugarcane, and the moment where they do the sweat before the number of potential bodies in the ground, is revealed to the community. And, we found a few, really, there was a lot of amazing shots all over the place that we didn't get to use. But, for example, for the sweat, we found a few more that really, I think, elevated that. And then we also did one of our only, it's not technically a dissolve, but it's a crossfade. It looks like a dissolve. Where my cousin, who's the medicine man, his name's Dave Archie, he like disappears in that moment. Like, we got to do some fun, cool stuff.
Yeah, that was actually the night we found out about Sundance. We had a kind of little editing hub on one side in Manhattan, and our editors were in Brooklyn, and we were sending scenes back and forth, and we were cutting that scene in particular. And there was this crazy idea where it's like, Jules, like, what if Dave was standing at the fire and then disappeared, and the next time you saw him, he's in the sweat? And so we put together the scene, and then we sent it to Maya and Nathan, who added a cross dissolve, because we had cut it as like back to back, like he's there and then he's not there, which was a very cool effect. And then they added this little, this one little trick. So it was a very cool collaboration, the way we'd all
And
built off each other.
there were lots of examples of, and I think that's been one of the biggest rewards of this film. I think that Em and I both come from very individual artistic practices in our own ways, and the experience of creation, I think, for any artist is like the best high in the world. But then getting to share that, with a group of people who are incredibly talented, who are giving something their all, where your ideas and thoughts and emotions, collide with and enhance theirs. It's hard to explain to somebody how transcendent that can feel.
Can I ask you guys, the film is so powerful, it's so moving, it's traumatic. You lived it, you both lived it. How did you look after yourselves during the making of a film like this?
I think that we looked out for each other a lot. I think that was a big part of this. I think that we knew that we could rely on each other to not just do the best possible job that we can do. For example, when I was, a subject of the documentary, I had to be fully present in what I was doing. And so that meant that Em was shooting and directing and producing in those moments. So, for example, the scene where me and my dad have that really intense conversation at the motel, like Em found the motel and found the exact room at the motel where, it would have a real road trip kind of motel vibe, right? And that was not something that I had the headspace to be thinking through, but that, I could rely on Em to be doing that while we were, in the moment. And then I think also this film is at the end of the day, a lot of it is about spirituality and culture, right? That was the core mission of the residential schools. And one of the ways that we were taken care of by the community, and in particular by Charlene and her sort of very traditional wing of our nation, was by attending ceremonies. There would be ceremonies and sweats that were specifically held for us, and that was a core part of the making of the documentary. In a way, we think about the process of making this itself as a ceremony in a sense.
And I'll just add one more thing, which is like there are very hard moments of this film, but it was such a joy to make. It was such an incredible experience. It was filled with a lot of love and a lot of trust and epic adventures, being on the road with Jules and Ed and Chris and the four of us just in a car, having a blast. And, also bearing witness to people overcoming tremendous adversity and just exhibiting unmatched courage is a deeply fulfilling and inspiring experience. And so as hard as there were moments that were very difficult, it was also the most profound experience of my life and filled with just incredible joy.
Wonderful. And just one last question then. I kind of watching it and also, being aware of other stories in the world in which these kinds of things have happened. And just, some of the things that happen to children in that residential school, like, where's the justice in it? Or like, what do you think can come from your film and what would you like to see happen next?
I think that the most encouraging part of this experience, probably for both of us, has been to see the work that it has done when we've gone and showed it out in Indian country. Obviously, there's a lot that the government, the church, should and ought to do, including especially open up the records. But ultimately, the most important part of this entire process is people who survived these schools and their families, talking about what they experienced. There have been many moments in the part of this film where we've brought it to Indian country, to Indigenous communities, where people have, stood up and said something like, I saw so much of myself or my father's story, my grandparents' story in this film. And also where, multiple generations of a family have come and seen this film, and ultimately the elders have imparted some part of their residential boarding school experience upon the younger generations, or even where people who endured, intergenerational trauma or trauma themselves at the residential schools have finally shared that with members of their own family. And, it is such an honor to be part of that process across, Indian country, across Canada, across the United States.
We also hope that the film catalyzes a conversation, and has already begun to catalyze a conversation in the United States, where there were 417 of these federally funded institutions, that conversation that has barely begun. That said, the Interior Secretary, the first Indigenous cabinet minister, Deb Haaland, has been leading an inquiry into these schools and was at our Sundance premiere, and the film is going to be shown at the Senate next week with the Boarding School Healing Coalition, and is part of a conversation pushing forward a bill calling for a truth commission that is currently heading to the Senate in the United States. So the film is actually part of a pretty massive movement towards actual policy change. In Canada, there's a rush to get to this reconciliation part, and our film kind of insists that we don't know the truth yet. And we also hope that ricochets into countries that have similar histories, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Russia with the Sami people, and, places like Ireland, where the Catholic Church had a very similar impact on children and young mothers. And we hope at the very least the Catholic Church is pressured to open their records, so that at the very least survivors and their descendants can know the truth. If not, the Catholic Church participate in some sort of fiscal compensation for what they've done, which has not happened yet, though the Canadian government has paid some, the U.S. government and the church have not. And so we are hopeful that, the film is helping to heal communities who have experienced these horrors, that it empowers them to decide what kind of justice they would like to see, because ultimately that is up to them. But also that it starts a kind of continental and international conversation about what the victims of these histories are owed, and how those intergenerational impacts are felt so urgently in Indigenous communities today.
Thanks a million, Emily. Thanks a million, Julian. Real pleasure to talk to you, and best of luck with the film.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks again to Emily and Julian for taking part in the interview. Sugarcane is on release in selected Irish and UK cinemas from right now. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. You'll find me on social platforms as Ross Whitaker TV, and of course, thanks to you for listening.